So we'll wait a few minutes and see if anyone shows up before we start. I can see like a little viewer count. So if somebody shows up, we'll go ahead and start. If not, we have a few viewers here. So welcome to the Mountain House High School School Site Council for February 23rd. We're going to go ahead and get started here. So tonight, our focus is on supporting struggling learners. And I have several people with me on the site council tonight, so I just want to introduce them real quick. I'm Brian Shum. I'm the Associate Principal of Curriculum Instruction. And with us tonight, we have a pair of ELA teachers and a pair of science teachers. So we have Mary Lindsay and Leighton Scott representing the ELA department. And we have Donna Earl and Carolyn Gallagher representing our science department. So tonight, our objective is just to give participants an understanding of supports provided for students who are struggling with learning, both at the school level and the classroom level. So we're going to hear from our teachers some of the things that are going on in the classroom, and I'll talk more about the school level supports. So our agenda is we're going to do a brief introduction to our teachers here. I'm going to provide an overview of current data on where we are and how we target struggling learners. Then I'll talk about some supports for struggling students, and we'll wrap it up tonight with a Q&A. So if you have any questions or feedback or suggestions, we would love to hear that, and you'll be able to put that into the chat here at the end. So I just want to get us started off here by hearing from our teachers. So I just asked them the question, how do you support struggling learners in the classroom? So I'm going to throw it to Mary Lindsay, one of our ELA teachers, to talk about what she's doing in her classroom.
Hi, I'm Mary Lindsay. I teach Honors English 10 and AP English Literature. Some of the things that I do to help struggling learners is anticipating where students are going to struggle and knowing that students are going to struggle in places where maybe I'm not anticipating, and build extra time into everyday lessons to ensure that there's time to deal with those issues as they come up. So I build checks for understanding into every lesson, and set aside sometimes as few as 5, but sometimes up to 20 minutes to work with students who have struggled with that day's lesson to ensure they're going to be successful, not just on that day's content, but as the content builds on itself and moves forward.
And Mary, you talked about checks for understanding. How do you use those to determine which students you're going to work with?
Yeah, so checks for understanding in my classroom are usually pretty small. I'm checking for little pieces of knowledge that students need or needed to understand from the day's lessons. And I usually build in supports through peer connections, having students who are struggling work with an elbow partner, somebody sitting next to them, to clarify their thinking. But I also work with those students by either pulling them aside to a table where we work together on those concepts, or if it's a smaller group or a group that maybe needs extra time, using our success period to work with those students.
Okay, perfect. And to hear more about some of those strategies you're using as we go along too. Next up, we have Donna Earl. Donna, you want to share some of the strategies you're using?
So similar to what they're doing in English, I teach chemistry predominantly. So most students cringe because it's got, the language component for new vocabulary, but it also has a lot of math. So we do a lot of in-class practice, a lot of partner share. And then, we practice, then we go over the board and we review. So we do a lot of those kind of like practice, come back, check for understanding, practice, come back, a lot of elbow partner share. And then when assessments are low, so those little miniature like lesson quizzes or other activities, I use that as a trigger to bring students in for success, where we'll do more of a one-on-one or a smaller group practicing of whatever skill set that they're struggling with.
Perfect. So you're talking about using success too and really targeting specific students based on the assessments that you're giving in class.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donna.
Thanks.
Next up, we have Leighton Scott, also from our English Language Arts department.
Hi everyone. I'm Leighton Scott. I teach ninth grade and 12th grade English. And I use a lot of similar strategies to some of my colleagues, definitely pulling into that success session that we have, and the frequent checks for understanding. But also a lot of group work and partner work, like you've heard the term elbow partner used. I really like to group my students in groups when they're seating. Right now, I've got them in groups of 4. I think that's a good way for them to kind of like have their own checks and balances. It's nice for them to see what their peers are doing, and also maybe sometimes have their peers also help redirect them or answer their questions. I know I have some students who, after I've explained something, they'll ask the person sitting next to them what they're doing, and they'll get that explanation from their peer, which can be really helpful for kids who might not fully grasp what's going on at the moment.
Perfect. So in addition to those supports that you're building in, making sure you have like a deliberate structure for those groups to work together is really important to you. Thank you. And last up, we have Carolyn Gallagher. And I apologize, this slide didn't get updated.
Hi guys, I'm Carolyn Gallagher. I teach biology, which is mostly freshmen, but a couple other grades in there too. One of the ways that I support struggling learners in my class is utilizing success time. I'll use that to reteach individual skills, but I've also started using it to do one-on-one check-ins with my students who have D's or F's. And we talk about their current progress. And really what I'm trying to focus on is helping them strategize for ways to improve, and trying to get them to come up with ways that they can do better. So for example, the last time I pulled students in, we talked about their last test grade, and I told them that we had another test coming up, and I said, what can you do differently this time so that you get a bit of a higher grade? And if, sometimes because they are freshmen and they're not used to being, at the high school, sometimes if they say, I don't know, I can lead them through, okay, well, did you study? What did that look like? What would it look like if you did study? Did you do your retakes? Kind of just guiding them through those procedures and modeling that process of what they should be doing to help them start thinking about it like a high schooler, because still they've only been with us for 4 months. I had a student say, oh, well, I didn't know that I had to do this to do a retake. And that, was shocking to me. But even though I teach that in my class, it falls through the cracks. So just that one-on-one check-in to make sure that they're understanding procedures that can help them can be helpful.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think that's such an important strategy. Just having that conversation, engaging the students in thinking about their own thinking, especially as freshmen coming into the high school, really sets the stage for them to be successful. So I appreciate that and all the strategies that were shared. And we're going to talk some more about those as we move on too. I want to start off just giving an overview of some current data from the high school. So this data is from our semester 1 grades that went out. These are from December at the end of the first semester. We actually had a batch that's a little bit more current, but that's just a progress report. So this looks at our last official grades that were posted. And you can see overall, our students are pretty successful. And this data matches the grade data that we've been pretty consistent with for the past several years. So if you look at the chart there, and looking at grades, students are getting an A, B, and C. That makes up almost 93% of our students. And those are total grades given. So when we're looking at D's and F's, that makes up about 7% of the grades. So overall, our students are doing really well. And this shows on test scores across the board. But if we just focus on what is going well, we're not seeing the whole story here, because we still have a lot of students who are in a situation where they need some additional supports. So this is from the same grading period, and this is the number of students with D or F as a percent of the total school population. So you can see on that first semester, those first semester grades, we had 206 students who had at least one D or F. And as you go down there, you see that we had 7 students who had 7 or more D's or F's. So those are students who are struggling in every single one of their classes, and they're taking 7 classes. So the number of students who are struggling at that level, thankfully, isn't a huge number of students, but we want to make sure that we're focusing on them too, and not just the students who are doing well. So we have a lot of ways that we're building in supports for them. I'll share a little bit more data. We look at grade reports at every progress report and report card to look for trends and identify those students who are struggling, identify particular classes that they might be struggling in. Another data point that we use is the MAP test. So students take this starting in second grade all the way up through seniors in high school, and they take it 3 times a year. And they take it in the subjects of both reading and math, and this gives us some pretty good growth data, or just overall data about how students are doing in those 2 big subject areas. So we do have a proficiency cutoff. There's a cut score on the math test, and if students hit that score, that projects that they will be proficient on the state CAF test in either reading or math. So once they hit that score, we have a deal with students who do not have to take that MAP test again for the rest of the year. So in the fall, we had 227 students meet that proficiency score out of the almost 2,000 students at the high school. 198 in reading, and we had 765 students, almost half of our students, meet that proficiency score for both. So that means that those students don't have to take the MAP test again this year in either reading, math, or both. Then the winter, those students who had already met that proficiency band didn't have to take it again, but we had another 126 students meet that in math, and another 169 meet that in writing or reading. So overall, we had 57 and 58% of our students already meet that proficiency cutoff, where they're projected to meet the proficient level on the CASP exam as 11th graders. So overall, that's really outstanding data. Again, we see that our students do strongly in reading and math in their courses, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So we still have some students who are struggling. In the lowest percentile in math and reading, we had 94 and 72 in the fall. Then in the winter, we identified 85 students who are in that lowest proficiency band and 68 in reading. And some of those students are coming to us with reading scores that show they have an equivalent of about the 3rd grade. So we still have students who are struggling with some basic skills. They have a hard time accessing the materials and the instruction in our classes, and we want to make sure that we're building in supports for those students. So there's a few ways that we do support them. We use a student support model that's based on tiers, and we start with tier 1, and that's where a lot of our focus is on. And these are universal interventions. These are interventions that are applied to all students in all settings. So this is our guarantee that if you're in a class here at the high school, you're getting support through these systems. And that includes good first teaching, which I'll talk about in just a second, our PLC process that we use to organize our collaborative teams of teachers and us as a school, and our success periods. I think every teacher talked about the success period, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So students who aren't successful with those tier 1 universal supports, there's some additional layers built in for them. About 80 to 90% of our students, those tier 1 supports are going to work. But tier 2, we have about 5 to 15% of our students fall in that category. These are targeted interventions, and they're targeted to groups or individuals at risk. And there's different ways we can support them. One is through a student study team or a 504 plan. I'll talk about both of those. But we also have specific classes like an ELD class for new language learners. Then we have summer school as a support set up for those students who weren't successful during the normal school year. They can come and get caught up in credits and still maintain a track for graduation. Then tier 3, we're not going to talk about tonight. This only impacts a very few students, a very small percentage. And these are groups or individuals who are at high risk. So for these students, we have alternative programs. We have our EPIC program, which is credit recovery. It's for those students who aren't successful in a normal high school learning environment, and we have specific classes set up for them. We also have special education. So in some cases, we have students who have diagnosed learning disabilities who can't access the curriculum or the instruction, and they're put on an IEP plan to get individualized intensive supports for them. But tonight we're going to focus on those Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports. So one of our Tier 1 focuses this year is really on good first-time teaching. Our goal is to make sure that when students come into a class, whatever it happens to be across the school, whether it be science or ELA, PE, health class, we want 80 to 85% of those students to achieve the learning objective the first time it's taught. So whatever the teacher is focusing on in that lesson for the day, we want 80 to 85% of those students to walk away having mastered that, at least at a basic level. So there's a couple essentials that we focus on that we want to see going on in the classroom every day to support that. The first one is a clear learning objective. That's where the teacher is communicating to students what it is that they're supposed to learn in that class period and how they're going to demonstrate having learned it. There's pretty clear research that shows just going through that and communicating with that student makes them more likely to learn what it is that the teacher is focusing on, just making sure it's clear. And the second part of that is communicating the why of the lesson. We call this a pitch or hook. So in addition to introducing that learning objective today, the teacher focuses on some way to make that relevant to students. How does it connect to what they've already learned? How does it connect to their life experience in some way? So if you're teaching a math lesson, you don't just come in and say, hey, we're talking about math today. You're making some kind of connection between the math and their life somehow, or how it's important. Content literacy strategies. So these are just ways that we're engaging students in reading, writing, listening at our discussion, and making sure we're very deliberate about that. Leighton talked about engaging students in group work. That's an example of getting them discussing. So again, there's a lot of research that shows that when we are very deliberate about engaging students in this, the more successful they're going to be. And then finally, once we've gone through the lesson, where we've introduced an objective, we've made the relevance clear, we've used very deliberate content literacy strategies to engage students in the learning process and make them do the work, we have a check for understanding. These actually come throughout the period, where as a teacher goes over new material or introduces something, they do a check to see if students actually learn what it is that they were teaching. And I just want to throw it out to the teachers real quick. Can you give me an example of a check for understanding that you use frequently?
So one of the ones that I have been using more and more with giving feedback to student writing. My honors sophomores write about a paragraph every single day. And it's not really possible for me to read 140 paragraphs in one day and get really solid feedback to students and really check what their level of understanding is. So one of the things I've started using is peer checks. I give students something very specific to look for in their partner's work, have a discussion about what they saw, and then give them a step for if you saw this in their writing, they should do this next step. And if you saw that in their writing, they need to do that next step. And it really helps students be able to check themselves because they're getting the same instruction. So they're paying attention to their own writing and a partner's writing to guide each other in the writing process.
Perfect. Thank you, Mary. So that's a really good example of a check for understanding where students are getting feedback, and then they're changing or there's some kind of action based on that feedback. So in her case, students are giving that feedback to each other based on a process that she set up, and they're changing their work based on that. So that's our goal. We want teachers to be able to monitor what students are doing and be able to take action. So if they see some students are struggling with it, they can support those students. These are our goals for every lesson. And these are good for all of our students, even those students who are doing well We saw that grade data, we saw that testing data. We know most of our students are doing pretty well, but this becomes absolutely essential for those students who need it the most. So important tier one strategy, those good first teaching focuses. The second major thing that we have set up to support tier one is the PLC process that we use in the school. So one of the unique things about Mountain House High School is that all of our teachers have a daily collaboration period. And that's not something that you find at most schools. Many schools have it once a week. Some schools have it not at all. But we've built this into the day every single day. And it's one of our guideposts that is not going anywhere because it is effective, not just for our teachers in allowing that collaboration with each other, but for students, because the conversations that they have in that collaboration period and that planning that they have in it is essential for setting the stage for learning that's more effective. So in that PLC process, the objective is to really focus on 4 questions. What do we want students to learn? So teachers are collaboratively defining what exactly it is and being clear about what it is they want their students to learn. They're talking about how they're going to know if students learned it. So they develop their assessments together. Then they administer those assessments or those checks for understanding like Mary talked about. And then they have a plan. What do we do if they didn't learn it? So those students who didn't learn it the first time, we didn't capture them the first time around, which was our goal for that 80 to 85%. What do we do with those students? And some of the teachers talked about having time carved out in that class period. Sometimes it becomes we send them to success, but there's a plan there. And we're also thinking about what do we do if they already know it? So this is where it impacts our students who are high performing. If you've already mastered that, what do you have as a next step then? So the PLC process is really set up to guide the collaboration that our teachers are doing to become more effective at their job in supporting our students. And that feeds into our philosophy of intervention. When we do see some students are struggling, when we've defined that essential skill, when we've done that check for understanding or given that assessment, we've identified those students who are not doing well, they're not demonstrating mastery, we require them to come to some sort of intervention. And another unique part about the schedule that we have at the high school is we have a daily success period. So each of our departments has a priority day where they can schedule students to come in and meet with teachers from that department. But they can also request them to come in on different days. So if the student is only struggling in 1 or 2 classes, they can be shared in between those classes. And that's a chance for them to get extra support during that success period. And again, this is really important to support this idea of we're requiring students to come to intervention and not just inviting them. So again, many schools have a schedule where they might ask a student to come after school, before school, at lunch, and that just does not work because they don't show up. So we've actually carved out the time during the day to require students to come to that intervention. And again, this comes from the PLC process itself. So as teachers are going through these cycles of assessment, they're continually asking, what do we want students to learn? How do we know if they've learned it? What do they do if they didn't? Well, if that's the case, we offer that extension or that intervention for them, and we have them come to success where they can retake assessments. And some of our teachers were talking about really talking with the students one-on-one. Carolyn was talking about that, having those conversations, having the students explain what it is that they need to do to improve their score, and then they get an opportunity to redo an assessment. Or they get to come in and work with a teacher on some individual skills that the teacher saw that they were lacking in. So all of this is being fed by the PLC process. So what happens if Tier 1 doesn't work? So we do a lot of work collaboratively in teams. Our teachers are doing a lot of great collaboration with each other. We're doing a lot of great work with that good first teaching in the classroom. Sometimes we're going to have students who, for whatever reason, are still going to struggle. Sometimes it's academic reasons. Sometimes it's emotional reasons, oftentimes it's a combination of those. So in that case, we have to offer some tier 2 targeted interventions. I'm going to talk specifically about the next step with student support team and 504 plans. If you find yourself in a situation where you might think that would be a good option for your student. So the first option that we have for students who are struggling is an SST. It's a student study team. And anyone can request an SST at any time. And these are meetings that are run by the counselor. So when these are requested, the counselor will reach out to parents, all of the students' teachers, and we like to have the student there too, especially at the high school level. They're an essential part of the learning that's going on and being able to diagnose the problem. So the student attends it as well. And what the SST does is it reviews data. So they take a look at grades. We'll determine, we'll look at test scores. We'll determine if there's any areas we need to focus on over others. Each member of the team will share some strengths of the student, as well as opportunities. So if they see things that are happening in the classroom that may be contributing to them not learning in the classroom, they can share those as opportunities for growth. And it's important to have everyone there because it's good to get all of the different perspectives from home, from the parents, from the teachers, and from the student too. The student's very well aware most of the time of their own strengths and their own opportunities, and they're very honest about it. And those points become really important when we determine the supports for the student. So in the SST process, we can write out a plan to help support that student. It gets shared with all the teachers, and the teacher and the students, the student and the teachers, they go out and they work on that for 6 to 8 weeks. Then you come back and review that and see if it's working. And if it's not, you tweak that. But it's important for an SST meeting for everyone to be able to meet together and share their perspectives and come up with supports together for that to work. So oftentimes when we get to a situation where there's an SST, it means that a student is struggling in multiple classes. And this is a good opportunity to share that across the board. The next option we have is a tier 2 support is a 504 plan. So a 504 plan is a little bit different than an SST. We always start in an SST to determine if that's working. But if there's a medical diagnosis that impacts the ability to learn, this can be turned into a 504. So in this case, we have another member of the team join. That's an administrator who runs the meeting. And we also have the counselor, the teacher, the parents, and the student present. And we do pretty much the same process where we review that data, we share strengths and opportunities, and again, we determine supports for that student. And when it comes to a 504, there's different supports that are available. We'll take a look at those in just a minute. And those get into accommodations and modifications. And accommodations are those things that are done to help a student access the curriculum in class, but not change the curriculum or the expectations. Modifications are things that are done to actually change what a student is required to do. And we'll look at that again in just a second. Those are reviewed annually. So once a 504 plan is put into place, that is something that follows them to the next year. And another review meeting is set up on the anniversary. And the team meets to determine if that is something that still needs to be in place. And I saw a question come in. I'll address that at the end. I just want to make sure that you know that we're not skipping over it. So this shows the difference between some modifications and accommodations. And again, accommodations affect the way a student accesses the curriculum. So examples of that could be extended time. The student just needs a little bit more processing time. It could be underlined or guided notes. So a teacher would provide some printed notes with some supports in a class period. Sometimes it's preferential seating, so just being seated closer to the board, or some kind of technology where they can get some read aloud support. So the student is still accessing the curriculum. Their curriculum is unchanged, but these are supports to be able to access it better. Then we have modifications, and these are a lot more rare on 504 plans. Usually these are reserved for an IEP plan, but sometimes they do come up. So modifications are directly altering the material or curriculum when there's a documented reason a student can't access it because of a medical condition. So it could be determined to be too difficult for the student. So example could be open note testing when other students wouldn't have access to that. So that's a change in the actual process itself. It's a modification to it. So two different ways in which a 504 can support a student. And here's just a comparison table, SST to a 504. SST will address academic or behavioral issues. Usually it focuses on just a few goals at a time because the SST team is going to work towards improvement, so I can remove that SST as soon as possible. So to say, okay, we're going to try these for 6 to 8 weeks. We're going to see if it works. If it does, cool. We're going to keep doing that. If not, we might add something or modify something that we're doing. These cannot allow for testing modifications. So an SST would not cover modifications for things like the AP test, the CASP test, anything like that. And again, it's reviewed every 6 to 8 weeks. A 504 plan, once that's put into place, that's something where federal law then protects the things that are put into place for that student. Again, a medical diagnosis that shows that there's a substantial impact to student learning would have to qualify for that. So sometimes we do get students who have a medical diagnosis, but the team determines it's not a significant enough impact to qualify for a 504 plan, and they would stick with an SST. One of the big important differences is that a 504 can allow for testing modifications. So these could be things like a separate setting. It could be extended time on official tests like AP exams or CASP tests. And they can follow a student to college. So once a student has a 504 plan established, it would go with them to whatever institution of learning that they go to next, and it would be reviewed by their student services department there. And they would follow the same process. It's still reviewed annually, but it can get them accommodations as they move on. So a couple differences there. So just provided an overview of our Tier 1 universal interventions, the way we focus on making sure all students are getting good instruction through the collaboration that teachers are doing and the strategies they're using in the classroom, and talk about a few of the supports that are available to students. So at this point, I'm going to open it up to some questions, and I see we got one here. How do you schedule an SST? I've reached out to my son's counselor about concerns and haven't heard back yet. So that's a great question. An SST meeting is run by the student's counselor. I will say over the past couple of weeks, counselors have been going through the master scheduling process. So they've been getting the students signed up for classes for next year, and they've been in the mix of that for about 3 weeks now. So they've been a little bit slow on the turnaround for that. If you have not heard back from the counselor in an appropriate length of time, my recommendation would be to reach out to the vice principal over your assigned alphabet. And they'll be able to get that process going. But again, if it's fairly new in the past week or so, I would give it a few more days to see if you hear anything about that SST process. It's always going to start with the counselor. It's a good question. Any other questions? They can be typed into the chat on the right-hand side of YouTube as you're watching. You're welcome. And again, if you don't hear back from a counselor, please feel free to reach out to me directly too, and I can get that process started for you. We'll wait just another minute or so to see if we get any questions. So I don't see any more coming through. So if you do have additional questions that you think of after we wrap tonight, please feel to reach out to me directly. Again, I'm Brian Shum. I'm the Associate Principal of Curriculum and Instruction, and I'll be happy to answer those questions for you. I want to thank the teachers who joined us tonight. They're taking time away from their families and their routines this evening to be with us, and I always enjoy hearing their insight, and I'm sure you did too. And I want to thank you for coming out tonight and learning a little bit more about how we're supporting our struggling students. So have a great night, and thanks for joining us this evening.